Sometimes one simple gesture can change everything. Stay with us until the end, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. The clinking of glasses, the rustle of silk gowns, and the hum of muted conversation created the usual atmosphere of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant. Waiters in crisp uniforms glided between tables, balancing trays with precision. A pianist in the corner filled the air with soft notes, the music carefully chosen to flatter the wealth of the room without drawing attention to itself. Everything about the restaurant was designed for discretion, the perfect backdrop for billionaires who valued both visibility and privacy. That was why the silence that fell over the room felt so unnatural, so heavy it seemed to bend the air itself. Cutlery froze in mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Dozens of eyes turned, startled, toward a small open space between the tables where something unexpected was happening. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery was standing there, his thin frame trembling. His legs were strapped into rigid metal braces that clanked softly whenever he moved, braces that had become both his cage and his lifeline since the car accident 2 years earlier. His father had avoided public appearances with him ever since. Tonight was supposed to be a carefully controlled experiment. Dinner at a high-profile restaurant, a quiet evening where no one would notice the boy's presence. But Lucas, guided by an impulse he himself barely understood, had risen from his chair. His hand extended awkwardly, fingers shaken as he reached toward a young black waitress who had just passed by his table. Her name was Diana Johnson, though no one in the dining room knew it. To them, she was simply part of the staff, invisible unless something went wrong. The piano's melody floated in the air like an invitation. Lucas wanted to dance. "Sir, control your son." The sharp voice of Mr. Thornton, the restaurant manager, sliced through the silence. His polished shoes clicked against the floor as he stepped closer, his expression severe. "That's inappropriate. This is not a dance hall, and our employees are not here to entertain children." At the Montgomery table, a storm brewed behind the unreadable face of Richard Montgomery, one of the richest men in the country, owner of Montgomery Investments. Richard was not accustomed to public embarrassment. He had swallowed his doubts about this evening, but now every eye in the restaurant was on him, waiting for his reaction. "Lucas, sit down." The words came out low and firm, heavy with authority. Lucas hesitated, his hand still hovering in the air, waiting, hoping. For 5 years, Diana had worked here long enough to learn invisibility. To wealthy patrons, she was part of the decor, someone who carried plates and refilled glasses but left no impression. She had learned to lower her gaze, to absorb insults without response, to vanish when conflict appeared. That was how one survived in places like this. But as she looked down at the boy's trembling hand, something shifted. Perhaps it was the loneliness in his eyes. Perhaps it was the memory of children she once worked with in her unfinished studies. Or perhaps it was simply the fact that she had been invisible long enough. "Mr. Thornton," she said calmly, her voice steady in the still air, "my shift is over." Before he could protest, she untied her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the tray she carried. Then she turned back to Lucas and smiled. "I can't dance in an apron." The collective gasp of the dining room was almost audible. Richard Montgomery shot to his feet, anger flashing in his eyes. "What do you think you're doing?" Diana met his gaze without flinching. "I'm accepting an invitation, sir." And then, without waiting for permission, she took Lucas's hand. The boy's first step was hesitant, the brace dragging across the polished floor with a screech. The sound made several patrons wince, but Diana did not react. She didn't guide him or try to correct his rhythm. She simply adjusted her own pace to his, letting him lead. A woman at a nearby table leaned toward her husband and whispered, "She'll be fired tomorrow." Richard remained frozen, his breath caught in his throat. Against his will, memory intruded, the sight of his late wife, Elizabeth, laughing as she danced with their son in the living room. "It's not about perfection," she had said, her hands steadying Lucas's small shoulders. "It's about connection." For the first time since the accident, Lucas wasn't being held upright by therapists, corrected by doctors, or pitied by relatives. He was leading. And, in his eyes, the fear began to fade. Concentration replaced hesitation. Shame turned into something else, a shy kind of pride. The dance lasted only 3 steps. Then Diana gently returned Lucas to his chair. She inclined her head with formal dignity, as though addressing not a child but an adult. "Thank you for asking me out," she said. "It was an honor." She turned to leave, her steps calm, her face expressionless. "Wait." Richard's voice sounded unfamiliar to him, softer, rougher. "What's your full name?" "Diana Johnson, sir." Richard repeated it under his breath as though memorizing it. Then he reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, and extended it to her. "My office, tomorrow, 10 a.m. Every ear in the restaurant caught the words. Diana accepted the card without showing emotion, though her hand trembled slightly as she slipped it into her pocket. From the table, Lucas's voice rang out, high and innocent. "Dad, why did you do that?" Richard looked at his son, and for the first time in 2 years saw not a fragile patient, not a broken child, but a complete human being whose wants and needs he had systematically ignored. As the restaurant resumed its cautious noise, the evening proceeded in awkward silence. Yet no one failed to notice the way Diana glanced back one last time before leaving. It was not the glance of someone defeated or afraid. It was the glance of a woman with calm determination, a woman who had just shifted the ground beneath the feet of one of the most powerful men in America. The morning sun bounced off the glass and steel of Montgomery Tower, a gleaming skyscraper that dominated Midtown Manhattan like a monument to power. For ordinary pedestrians, it was just another fortress of corporate wealth, but for Diana Johnson, walking through its revolving doors felt like stepping into a foreign country. She had dressed in her best, a navy skirt and a white blouse she had bought on sale months ago, carefully pressed the night before. Her black heels clicked against the marble floor as she approached the receptionist's desk, her thrift store purse clutched tightly against her chest. "Diana Johnson to see Mr. Montgomery," she said quietly. The receptionist, a woman with flawless makeup and a cold, practiced smile, gave her a long once-over before picking up the phone. After a brief conversation, she hung up and said, "18th floor. Miss Winters will escort you." The elevator ride felt endless. The mirrored walls reflected not just Diana's figure, but her determination. She didn't feel fear. She had faced too much in her life for fear to dominate her now. Instead, what she carried was resolve, a calm inner strength. When the elevator doors opened, Miss Caroline Winters, Richard Montgomery's senior assistant, was waiting. Mid-40s, sharp suit, posture stiff as steel. She regarded Diana with the kind of detached authority that came from years of guarding power. "Mr. Montgomery is in a conference call," Winters said. "Follow me." As they walked down the hallway lined with glass offices, Diana felt the stares. Executives glanced up from their desks, curious about the black woman in modest clothes being escorted into the executive wing. She could feel their silent judgments pressing against her like humidity. When they reached a waiting lounge, Winters stopped. Her tone softened just enough to sound like a warning. "He had you fired, didn't he? That's usually what happens. Powerful clients complain, and people like you lose their jobs." Diana raised an eyebrow. "People like me?" Winters adjusted her glasses. Employees who don't know their place. Diana smiled faintly, not with amusement, but with quiet defiance. And where exactly would that place be? Before Winters could answer, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. He'll see you now. The office of Richard Montgomery was vast, occupying half the floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the city as if the man owned every skyscraper in sight. Richard stood at the window, hands clasped behind his back, his reflection superimposed over the cityscape. "Mr. Montgomery," Diana said formally as she entered. Richard turned, his expression carefully composed. "Miss Johnson, thank you for coming." He motioned to a chair. "Please." She sat, keeping her back straight, her gaze steady. The silence stretched. Diana recognized the tactic instantly. He was waiting for her to grow nervous, to babble, to incriminate herself. She refused to give him that satisfaction. Finally, Richard spoke. "Do you have a background?" Diana tilted her head. "Excuse me?" "Education, college." Her tone remained calm. "Bachelor's degree in child development from NYU. I began a master's in special education, but I had to leave the program before completion." Something flickered across his face. Surprise. "And yet you work as a waitress." "I work 3 jobs, actually," she corrected. "The restaurant, a bookstore on weekends, and tutoring when I can get students." Richard moved to his desk and picked up a folder. "I did some research on you after last night. I wanted to understand who the woman was who—" He hesitated, uncomfortable with the words. "Who danced with my son." He opened the folder and spread photographs across the table. Diana recognized them instantly. Images of children in wheelchairs, children with braces, children moving awkwardly but joyfully in a small community hall. Posters on the walls read, "Freedom Steps." "You founded this program 6 years ago," Richard said. "I co-founded it," Diana corrected, "with my sister, Zoe. It's a dance initiative for children with physical disabilities." Richard flipped through more documents. "It's about to close due to lack of funding." Diana's expression didn't change. She had expected him to find everything. "I'm not here to ask you for money, Mr. Montgomery." "Then why are you here?" "Because you invited me." Richard let out a short laugh, sharp and humorless. "Fair enough." He closed the folder and walked around the desk, restless. "I want you to work for me." Diana blinked, surprised. "As a waitress? In your home?" Richard's face hardened. "As a therapeutic companion for Lucas." His son's name caught in his throat, as if saying it cost him something. His eyes flickered briefly toward a photograph on his desk. Elizabeth, his late wife, smiling as she held a baby. "I have the best specialists in the country," Richard continued. "Physical therapists, neurologists, psychologists. But what you did last night—" He stopped, frustrated with himself. "It was just a dance, Mr. Montgomery," Diana said softly. "It was the first time I've seen him smile since the accident," Richard admitted. The words seemed dragged out of him. "I don't want a dancer for my son. I want someone who can do what you did. Follow, not lead." Diana studied him. Beneath the mask of authority, beneath the billionaire's armor, she saw something rare. Desperation. "I can pay you 5 times what you earn now," Richard pressed. Diana rose from her chair. "No." Richard's eyes widened. He wasn't used to that word. "You're turning down an offer that would solve your financial problems?" "Out of dignity," Diana answered calmly, "and because your son deserves more than someone you've hired to pretend to care. You don't need someone who obeys you, Mr. Montgomery. Lucas doesn't need another expert. He needs space to lead his own life." Richard flushed, his control cracking. "You don't know my son." No, Diana agreed, but I know children like him, and I know that the cages society builds are often harder to break than braces. She reached into her purse and placed a card on his desk. Freedom Steps. Classes on Tuesdays and Thursdays, 4 p.m. If you'd like to bring Lucas, the first class is free. She turned toward the door. In the hallway, Miss Winters was waiting, clearly having listened through the door. Her eyes were wide with disbelief. You just turned down Richard Montgomery. Are you insane? Diana smiled faintly. Maybe, but I'd rather be insane than be property. That night, Diana sat in her tiny Bronx apartment. Her sister Zoe, wearing her hijab loosely after a long day, leaned against the kitchen counter. You think he'll bring Lucas? Zoe asked. Diana set her purse down. I don't know. Men like him don't usually come to places like ours. But even as she spoke, she remembered Lucas's eyes when he danced, the fragile pride, the hint of freedom, and she allowed herself a quiet thought. Don't underestimate the power of a determined son. The next Wednesday, outside the community center, a black Bentley idled. Through the window, Diana spotted Lucas in the back seat, gazing anxiously out. In the driver's seat sat Richard, his hands gripping the steering wheel as though fighting a war with himself. Zoe peered over her shoulder. He's not coming in. Men like him never do. Diana smiled faintly. Wait and see. And then the car door opened. The community center sat on a quiet street in the Bronx, a converted warehouse with fading red bricks and a cracked sidewalk leading to its door. To the passing eye, it looked ordinary, perhaps even neglected, but inside lived something rare, an atmosphere of freedom. The walls were decorated with handmade posters painted by the children themselves. Your rhythm, your rules. Every move counts. Bright colors tried to cover peeling paint, and though the building lacked polish, it pulsed with life. That Wednesday afternoon, the black Bentley parked at the curb looked as out of place as a diamond in gravel. Neighbors walking past slowed down, curious. Children at the windows whispered and pointed. For them, such cars belonged to another world. Inside the car, Lucas Montgomery adjusted his leg braces nervously. He kept glancing at the building, then back at his father. His hand twitched at the door handle, but he hesitated. Go on, Richard Montgomery said, his voice low, taut with tension. Are you coming in? Lucas asked. Richard's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being asked such questions. He wasn't used to uncertainty. I'll be right behind you. Lucas nodded, then opened the door. The metallic braces clinked as his small frame emerged into the Bronx sunlight. He moved slowly, awkwardly, but he moved. And behind him, to the astonishment of everyone watching, Richard Montgomery also stepped out. Gone were his custom suits and silk ties. Today he wore khaki pants and a sweater, clothes meant to appear casual but still screaming wealth to anyone who looked closely. Through the window, Diana Johnson saw them. She had been preparing herself all day for this moment, rehearsing calm in front of the mirror, telling herself not to expect too much. Yet, when she saw Lucas walking toward the door, with his father reluctantly trailing, something warm flickered inside her. She turned to her sister, Zoe, who stood beside her at the reception desk. I told you he'd come, Diana murmured. Zoe shook her head in disbelief. What did you do to convince a man like that? Diana didn't answer. She didn't need to. This wasn't about her. This was about a boy who wanted to dance. The reception area smelled faintly of disinfectant and crayons. A group of children were already gathered in the studio beyond, laughing as they experimented with movement under the hum of upbeat music. Some used wheelchairs, others prosthetic limbs, others braces like Lucas. For each of them, the room was not about what they couldn't do, but what they could. When Lucas entered, the children paused. They recognized the braces, the familiar struggle. For once, he wasn't the only one. "Welcome," Diana said, stepping forward. She wore a simple Freedom Steps t-shirt, her hair pulled back, her presence grounded. She knelt so her gaze met Lucas's. "Would you like to join us?" Lucas swallowed, glancing quickly at his father. Richard stood near the doorway, stiff as stone, unwilling to move farther into the room. He gave a small nod. "Go on." With that, Lucas shuffled forward. The children opened a space for him, as though instinctively understanding what it meant to arrive somewhere new. Diana guided him gently to the group, then stepped back, deliberately letting him choose. From the sidelines, Richard tried to keep his composure. His instinct was to intervene, to control, to make sure his son didn't stumble, didn't embarrass himself, didn't fail. But beside him, Zoe offered a chair. "The first day is always hardest," she said softly, "for the parents, not for the kids." "This isn't therapy," Richard muttered. "I've hired the best specialists for Lucas. This is just dancing." Zoe tilted her head. "And how has that been working out?" Richard stiffened but didn't answer. His eyes remained locked on his son. The music shifted into a gentler rhythm. The children moved in circles, improvising, each at their own pace. A girl in a wheelchair spun gracefully, her arms outstretched like wings. A boy with a prosthetic leg tapped his foot in a syncopated beat. Lucas watched with wide eyes. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. Slowly, hesitantly, he tried to mimic the movement of a boy near him. His brace screeched against the floor as he stepped. The sound made Richard's shoulders tense, but Diana didn't flinch. She nodded to Lucas encouragingly. "Don't copy them," she told him gently. "Find your own rhythm." Something in those words unlocked him. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment, swayed slightly, then tried again. His steps were uneven, but for the first time he wasn't just moving to keep balance. He was moving because he wanted to. The studio door opened. An older woman entered, leaning on an ornate cane. Her gray hair was braided elegantly, her presence commanding. Diana greeted her with warmth. "Dr. Elaine Mercer," she introduced. "Thank you for coming." Richard straightened in surprise. "Dr. Mercer? The neuroscientist? I rejected your research proposal 3 times. She smiled calmly. "Yes, Mr. Montgomery, and I remember each rejection." She moved to the children, watching them with careful eyes. "I now oversee the research program here. We study how non-directive movement fosters brain reconfiguration in children with motor challenges." Richard frowned. "Research? I thought this was just a community dance class." Diana walked over, her voice even. "Freedom Steps is a pilot rehabilitation program built on the principle of movement autonomy. We combine adaptive dance with neuroscientific theory." Richard's gaze narrowed. "Then why do you work as a waitress?" "Because people like you rejected our funding, and because children don't stop needing us just because the money runs out." The words cut sharper than intended. Richard shifted uncomfortably. He looked back at the studio, where Lucas was now moving in tandem with another boy. His awkward steps were imperfect, but his eyes glowed. Then it happened. Lucas stopped, his breath heavy. He bent down, fumbled with the straps of one of his braces, and unlatched it. The heavy metal clattered against the floor. "Lucas?" Richard took a step forward, fear spiking in his voice. "Wait," Diana whispered, placing a hand gently on his arm. "Watch." All eyes turned to the boy. The music hushed. Even the other children stilled, as though sensing the weight of the moment. Lucas steadied himself on one brace alone. His legs trembled. His face tightened with concentration. Slowly, shakily, he took one step forward. The room erupted. Children cheered. A girl clapped. Someone shouted his name. Camera flashes went off. Unnoticed until that very instant, reporters had entered the studio drawn by an article Zoe had published that morning. Richard's face broke. The mask of control, of indifference, of power, it all crumbled. Tears pooled in his eyes as he watched his son, unassisted, make a step that every doctor had told him was impossible for years to come. "That's why we created Freedom Steps," Diana said softly beside him. "It's not about perfect steps. It's about first steps on your own." Richard pressed his lips together, unable to speak. He had seen his son struggle in sterile therapy rooms, his body manipulated like a machine. But this was different. Lucas wasn't being forced. He was leading. For the first time in years, Richard saw his son not as a patient, not as a responsibility, but as a person discovering his own strength. The cheers continued, the flashes lit the room, and the billionaire who had built an empire of control suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of something he could not command. His son had taken his first free step, and the world was watching. The cheers inside the Freedom Steps studio had barely faded when the questions began. Reporters pushed forward, their voices sharp, their cameras flashing. The air seemed to buzz with urgency, as if the single shaky step of a child had detonated a silent explosion no one could ignore. "Mr. Montgomery," one journalist called out, "is it true your foundation rejected funding for this program 3 separate times?" Richard Montgomery froze. The words hit like a spotlight cutting through the fog he lived in. All around him, children were watching, parents were watching, the staff was watching. More importantly, Lucas was watching. His son, still standing on one brace, eyes wide with triumph and anticipation. For years, Richard had been a master of image. He knew how to control a narrative, how to bury stories before they began, how to buy silence when necessary. But here, in this cluttered community center with paint peeling from the walls, he felt cornered. He had 2 options: retreat into anger, dismiss what had happened, protect his reputation as cold and calculating, or acknowledge the truth in front of everyone. He looked at Diana Johnson. She didn't say a word, but her steady gaze told him that silence now would destroy not just his son's moment, but any chance of change. A younger reporter shoved forward. "Mr. Montgomery, what do you say to those who accuse you of ignoring grassroots programs like this one while funding luxury projects that serve only your investors?" The crowd murmured. Richard felt heat rising in his chest. He glanced back at Lucas, who was still surrounded by children cheering him on. Lucas hadn't heard the question. He didn't care about investors or politics. He was smiling, sweating, breathing hard, but glowing with the kind of joy Richard had thought impossible since the accident. The memory of Elizabeth surfaced unbidden, her laughter, her insistence that Lucas was more than his limitations. "It's not about perfection, Richard. It's about connection." For a man like him, humility was foreign. It went against everything he had built. But the thought of walking away, of dismissing this moment, it felt like betraying not just Lucas, but Elizabeth as well. Richard's voice broke the silence. "You know what's hardest for people in my position." He spoke loudly enough for every ear to catch his words. "Admitting when we're wrong." The room stilled. Even the reporters paused, their pens hovering. Richard continued, his voice steadying. "The Montgomery Foundation is proud to announce a commitment to fully fund Freedom Steps for the next 5 years. We will also build a permanent rehabilitation center based on the methodology developed here by Dr. Mercer and Miss Johnson." Camera flashes exploded. Gasps echoed. Zoe, standing at the edge of the room, covered her mouth with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. Diana, though, remained calm, her face unreadable, her posture unshaken. Only her eyes betrayed a flicker of surprise. Richard raised a hand, silencing the noise. "On one condition," he added. The crowd leaned in. That Miss Johnson retained complete autonomy over the program and its methodology. No corporate interference, no strings attached. The words stunned even him. He had built an empire by controlling everything, by tightening his grip on every investment, every venture. And now, in front of cameras, he had promised to let go. Later that evening, after the reporters had left and the children had gone home, the center was quiet again. Richard sat in the empty studio, the sound of his son's laughter still ringing in his ears. Diana entered, carrying a box of supplies. "You cornered me," he said without looking at her. Diana set the box down. "No, your son cornered you. All I did was give him space." Richard turned, his eyes sharp. "You orchestrated this, didn't you? The press being here, the article this morning, the perfect timing." Diana didn't flinch. "Yes, because when we tried to reach you through proposals, through meetings, through official channels, you ignored us. Sometimes the only way to get through to people like you is to show them what they refuse to see." Richard leaned back, running a hand through his hair. "You used my son for a public relations stunt." "No," she corrected. "I followed him when he chose to step forward. That was all Lucas, not me." He fell silent, wrestling with the truth. In his world, manipulation was currency. But, watching Diana, he realized she wasn't interested in leverage or power. She had no interest in climbing his ladder. What she wanted was something he had never valued: freedom for those who had none. "Why didn't you just take my offer?" he asked quietly. "Because Lucas doesn't need another expert telling him what to do," Diana replied. "He needs someone willing to follow." The words struck deep. For decades, Richard had defined leadership as control. Now, here was a woman who insisted that real leadership was surrender. The following week, Freedom Steps buzzed with more attention than ever before. Parents brought their children in larger numbers. Journalists hovered outside. And Richard Montgomery, billionaire investor, was seen more than once entering the old warehouse-turned-studio, his presence sparking whispers across the city. Inside, though, he no longer looked like a man inspecting an investment. He looked like a father trying to understand. He watched Lucas laugh with the other children, sweat dripping down his forehead as he tried new movements. He saw the pride in his son's eyes when Diana treated him not as fragile, but as capable. Every visit chipped away at the walls Richard had built around himself. And every step Lucas took reminded him that the most powerful empires meant nothing if he couldn't follow his own son's lead. Still, Richard's world loomed. Investors asked questions. Board members raised eyebrows. His announcement about Freedom Steps had sent ripples through corporate circles. Why waste millions on a grassroots program? Why tie his name to something unproven? Richard listened, nodded, but inside, he knew the answer. Because for the first time in years, he had seen what real transformation looked like. And it hadn't come from numbers or profits. It had come from a child's shaky, independent step. The conflict was no longer between him and the press. It was inside himself, between the man who controlled everything and the father who finally understood he needed to let go. The choice lay before him: continue as he always had, or embrace the uncharted path his son had revealed. And as Richard stood once more at the edge of the studio, watching Lucas take another halting step surrounded by children cheering him on, He realized that his empire of control meant nothing in this room. Here, for once, he wasn't the leader. He was the follower. 6 months later, the grand opening of the Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center looked nothing like that tense evening in the Manhattan restaurant. The air here was alive with laughter, music, and the steady rhythm of children's movements filling a space designed entirely for them. The new facility, funded by the Montgomery Foundation but shaped by the children and their families, was unlike any clinic in the country. Sunlight streamed through wide glass windows. Hallways were painted with murals created by the kids themselves. Studios were wide and open, with adaptive flooring and mirrors positioned for wheelchairs and walkers. Every inch of the building spoke of liberation, not limitation. Diana Johnson stood at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, directing volunteers, greeting parents, guiding reporters. But, unlike the night in the restaurant, she wasn't invisible. She was the figure everyone wanted to speak to, the woman whose vision had turned into something unstoppable. Across the room, Lucas Montgomery prepared for the ceremony's highlight. He was no longer the trembling boy who dragged his braces through polished floors under the judgmental stares of strangers. Now, he wore only a lightweight brace on his left leg. A cane rested nearby for difficult days, but today he didn't want it. His face shone with concentration as he joined 3 other children in wheelchairs and on prosthetics, preparing for their first choreographed routine. The music began. A hush fell, and then the children moved, awkwardly, imperfectly, beautifully. Each gesture was their own, yet woven together in harmony. And there at the center, Lucas stepped forward with confidence that no doctor had predicted. His movements were still uneven, but he led the group with a smile that radiated pride. Richard Montgomery stood among the crowd, hands clasped loosely in front of him, not interfering, not commanding. He watched quietly, his eyes wet. When the routine ended, applause thundered. Children clapped, parents wept, journalists scribbled furiously. Lucas bowed, grinning ear to ear. "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore," Diana said softly, appearing at Richard's side. "No," Richard admitted, his voice thick, "but he still needs me to be around. That's the difference." He turned to her, meeting her eyes with a sincerity that startled even himself. "Thank you." "For what, exactly?" Diana asked. "For teaching me to follow." Reporters quickly gathered around Richard, microphones and cameras thrust forward. "Mr. Montgomery, how does it feel to see your son's progress?" one asked. Richard looked at Lucas, who was now helping a younger girl adjust her crutches, speaking with gentle encouragement. The billionaire drew a breath. Proud, not of what he's overcome, but of what he's created for others. Another journalist pressed forward. "And what's been the biggest lesson you've learned from this journey?" The man, once known only for his cold financial empire, looked directly into the cameras. His words came slowly, deliberately. "That true leaders aren't those who force others down the path they believe is right," Richard said, "but those who have the courage to follow when someone shows them a better way." The quote spread like wildfire. By evening, it appeared in headlines across the country. From Wall Street titan to student of a child, Richard Montgomery's transformation. A year later, Freedom Steps had expanded to 3 more cities. Diana Johnson received the Pediatric Rehabilitation Innovation Award, her methodology now being implemented in hospitals nationwide. She had gone from waitress to nationally recognized leader, yet she carried herself with the same quiet determination as always. Lucas, now 11, enrolled in a regular school. On some days he still needed his cane, but he no longer hid it with shame. Instead, he became a youth spokesperson for the program, telling other children, "Your steps don't have to look like anyone else's. They just have to be yours." His courage inspired countless families across the country. As for Richard Montgomery, his empire remained vast, but his priorities shifted. Board members whispered about how he had softened, how he spent too much time at the centers, how he invested in projects with no financial return. But for the first time in decades, Richard didn't care. Power, he realized, had never been about control. It was about presence, about knowing when to lead and when to follow, about giving others the chance to step forward. On the anniversary of the center's opening, Diana walked through the main hall, pausing by the photographs lining the walls. Each child had a portrait framed beside a note about their journey, their first steps, their first spins, their first moments of independence. At the end of the hallway was a new frame, empty but waiting. "Whose is this one for?" Richard asked, joining her. "Our future," Diana replied. "The children we haven't met yet." They stood together in silence, watching Lucas laugh with a group of new students. His joy filled the room, erasing the memory of the night when shame and silence had nearly defined his life. And in that moment, it became clear to both of them, the simple gesture of a dance, one child reaching out, one woman daring to accept, had grown into a revolution of dignity, connection, and freedom. Because true transformation, Richard now understood, never begins with money or power. It begins with the courage to take a first step and the wisdom to let someone else lead the way. If this story touched your heart, share it with others. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss the next one.